Sherlock Holmes and the Haunting of Fleet Street, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. It was in the waning days of November, a season of mists and melancholy, when London seemed to exhale fog and shadow from every crevice, that a curious notice in the Daily Telegraph first piqued my attention. Tragic death at Fleet Street Printing House. Apprentice dies under mysterious circumstances. Eyewitness claims spectral sightings. I had barely set the paper down upon the breakfast table in our rooms at 221B Baker Street when Holmes, seated opposite me and already immersed in his morning correspondence, glanced up with a glimmer in his eyes. "You've seen the Fleet Street item, I presume?" he asked without preamble. "Indeed," said I, gesturing toward the newspaper, though I am inclined to think it a piece of tabloid sensationalism. Holmes gave a thin smile. "And that, my dear Watson, is precisely why it merits investigation." Thus began what would come to be known in our private annals as the Haunting of Fleet Street, a case that would lead us through labyrinthine alleys of political sedition, midnight conspiracies, and a ghost story rooted more in human malevolence than in the supernatural. That very afternoon, Holmes and I made our way by hansom cab to the offices of Pickering and Sons, a venerable printing establishment nestled between two stony edifices on the north side of Fleet Street. The November fog lay thick, muting the clatter of hooves and softening the glow of gas lamps into phantoms of light. The foreman of the press, a stout man named Mr. Henry Rathwell, met us at the door. His ruddy face bore the ashen tint of recent trauma. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, wringing his cap in his hands. "I'm grateful you've come. The men are near revolt. They say the place is cursed." Holmes nodded curtly. "I would like to see the body and the site of the incident." We were led down into the bowels of the building, where the great machines groaned like leviathans in slumber. The pressroom, an immense chamber of stone and iron, reeked of ink and oil. In the center of the floor, a chalk outline still marked the position of the deceased apprentice, one Thomas Rigg. "He was a good lad," Rathwell murmured, "but ever since he claimed he saw a ghost on the night shift, he'd been changed." "How so?" Holmes asked, kneeling by the outline, magnifying glass in hand. "Skittish, eyes darting, jumping at shadows, and then 2 nights ago, he fell," Holmes said, indicating a nearby mezzanine level lined with stacks of plates. "From there?" "Aye, cracked his skull on the linotype housing, dead before he hit the floor." Holmes stood slowly, his gaze sweeping the rafters, the shadows between the great machines, the soot-streaked windows. "And what of this ghost?" he asked. "Has anyone else seen it?" Rathwell shifted uneasily. "A few of the nightmen. They describe it the same. White gown, long black hair, silent as the grave. Always at midnight. Always here." I could not suppress a shiver. Holmes turned to me, and I saw the old fire alight in his eyes. A specter that appears only under cover of darkness, in a place where dangerous ideas are given voice in ink and type? There is a mind behind this madness, Watson, and we shall find it. Over the following days, Holmes immersed himself in the world of printers and pamphleteers. I accompanied him through taverns where radical journalists drank under false names, through lodgings where typesetters slept 6 to a room, through musty archives of tracts with titles like "The Republic Vindicated" and "The Tyranny of Parliament." Our inquiries turned up a curious rumor that the press at Pickering and Sons was not only a commercial venture, but the clandestine heart of a seditious network publishing anti-government screeds. "Ghosts are rare, Watson," Holmes said one evening as we walked back from St. Bride's Church, the ancient sanctuary of the Printers' Guild. "But men willing to kill to protect their secrets are unfortunately common." "You think young Rigg discovered something?" Holmes nodded. "Perhaps he witnessed an illicit printing session, or read a proof he should not have. Either way, he became a liability. But to disguise murder as haunting, it seems theatrical." "Which makes it doubly effective," Holmes replied. "It preys upon the primal fears of the mind. It silences by suggestion." It was not long before we were summoned again to Pickering and Sons. Another witness had seen the ghost. "I swear by St. Peter," cried Mr. Aldwych, a compositor with trembling hands. "She passed right through the linotype press, like smoke." Holmes spent a long hour studying the machines, the rafters above, the mezzanine from which Rigg had fallen. He found at last a filament of silk thread stretched taut between two pulleys in the beams. "A trick of stagecraft," he murmured. "They've created a puppet ghost." And then, beneath a false floorboard in the manager's office, he uncovered a sheaf of unbound pages, pages printed in secret, bearing revolutionary manifestos. "The ghost is a diversion," Holmes said, eyes gleaming. "The real mystery lies in who is printing these and who is willing to kill to protect them." The next morning brought a visitor to our quarters. He arrived before breakfast, a tall, thin man with spectacles and a stiff collar who identified himself as Mr. Lionel Grigsby, a solicitor for Pickering & Sons. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice precise and clipped, "my clients wish to put an end to these ghost stories. They are disrupting business." As Holmes remarked weeks later, over his pipe in the warm haze of our sitting room, "Ideas, Watson, are the most dangerous ghosts of all." Chapter 2, Shadows in the Type Foundry. It was the following morning, gray and oppressive, when Holmes stirred from his violin practice and declared, with an air of quiet triumph, "We have, I believe, cut away the first veil, but more remain, Watson." I looked up from my notes, wherein I had begun a rough draft of the previous night's extraordinary conclusion. "You think there is more to be uncovered?" Grigsby and Aldwych seemed to be at the center of it. Holmes paced to the window, brushing aside the lace curtain. Outside, a vendor's cry echoed from Marylebone Lane, the day's fog pressing low over rooftops like a lid on a simmering pot. "Grigsby was the operator," Holmes said. "But the architect of this sedition? I doubt it. His manifestos are too organized, too well-financed, and, most notably, too dangerous to be his alone. Someone else is pulling strings behind the press." I set down my pen. "And how do you propose we find them?" Holmes turned. "By following the paper trail." We returned to Pickering & Sons later that day, under the pretense of verifying property inventories for legal recovery. The constabulary had temporarily shuttered the press for investigation, and Holmes used this interval to revisit the linotype storage and compositing bays. Holmes requested that I assist him in examining the foundry. This narrow annex, set apart from the main press room, held wooden drawers filled with molten lead typefaces and matrices, an odorous and claustrophobic chamber where ink-stained men once worked in half-light and sweltering heat. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a peculiar drawer beneath one of the typesetting benches. It had been marked in red wax and sealed with twine. He slit the seal. Inside, amid the type blocks, lay a false bottom. Beneath it, an oilskin-wrapped ledger. "What have we here?" I asked. Holmes unwrapped it carefully. "Financial records, but not from Pickering & Sons. This bears the watermark of another press entirely. Marston and Elbridge, Camden Town." He flipped through the entries. "Look. Payments issued to fictitious names, bulk paper shipments to addresses that don't exist, coded annotations. Someone used this foundry as a shell operation." "And you believe this Marston and Elbridge firm is involved?" "I believe it may be a front." Holmes removed several pages, folded them into his coat, and replaced the ledger. "We shall pay Camden Town a visit." Our journey north took us through soot-darkened alleys and along rail spurs where children played among ironworks and chimneys belched smoke in long, unbroken plumes. Camden, in its industrial heart, was a place of cartloads and warehouses, horse-dung and shouted labor. The office of Marston and Elbridge proved to be an unimposing brick structure set beside a textile dye works, its sign warped with age, its shutters drawn despite the hour. Holmes knocked. No reply. He tried the door. It creaked open. The interior was dim, the air thick with the scent of drying ink and mildew. We stepped inside cautiously, Holmes holding his revolver low at his side. "No one's here," I murmured. "On the contrary," Holmes said. "Someone was here recently. See the still warm ash in that brazier? The ink pot uncapped?" We moved further in. A small office with a rickety desk lay at the rear. Here, Holmes discovered a second ledger, hastily hidden beneath a sheet of blotting paper. It matched the one we had found at Pickering & Sons. Same code, same symbols. Suddenly, from above, there came a sharp creak. Footsteps. Holmes motioned for silence. We ascended the back stair with cat-like tread, the boards protesting beneath our weight. At the top, we found a garret room with a slanted ceiling, a table, and a makeshift bed. A man was rifling through a wooden chest, his back to us. "Stop right there," Holmes commanded. The man spun round, startled. He was gaunt, bespectacled, with printer's ink on his fingertips and a scar running from his left brow to his ear. "I'm not armed," he cried. "Don't shoot." Holmes lowered his weapon. "Who are you?" "My name's Caleb Fry," the man said. "I set type for Grigsby." "Not merely type," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "You managed the whole print run from Camden, didn't you?" Fry hesitated. "I just followed orders. I was paid." "By whom?" The man looked down. "I never met him face to face. That we called him the Bishop. Always wore a clerical collar. Paid in gold. He'd leave instructions in envelopes under the pew at St. Cyprian's." Holmes glanced at me. A religious contact point, a curious choice for a radical. "I think he was mocking us," Fry said bitterly. "Mocking the church, mocking everything." Holmes asked a dozen more questions, taking careful notes. Fry confessed he had seen Rigg once, trailing Grigsby weeks before his death. Rigg was no ordinary apprentice, he said. He'd been reading the pamphlets, asking questions. "You think he intended to expose you?" Fry nodded. "And that's why they made an example of him." We escorted Fry to Scotland Yard that evening. Inspector Lestrade, despite his usual reservations toward Holmes's unconventional methods, took the man into protective custody and agreed to investigate the mysterious bishop. In our cab home, Holmes was unusually quiet. He stared out the window as gas lamps passed like distant beacons. "I dislike this case, Watson," he said at last. "Why so?" "Because its stakes are not merely personal. They are ideological. A man like the bishop, if such a man exists, is dangerous not because he kills, but because he inspires others to kill." "Do you think he is real?" Holmes didn't answer at first. Then, "Yes, and I fear he is not finished." Back at Baker Street, we found a sealed envelope pinned to our door. Holmes removed it with a gloved hand and opened it in the sitting room. The message was typewritten. "Mr. Holmes, you tread in waters deeper than you know. Return to your violin and your fireplace. Fleet Street belongs to the dead now. B." Holmes read it aloud. Then he handed it to me, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, "is no longer a matter of print and ink, Watson. It is war by another means." He turned and without another word, lit the message in the fire. Chapter 3. The bells of St. Cyprian's, I insist. The morning after receiving the bishop's ominous note, Holmes rose earlier than usual. The gray light of dawn bled across the fog-veiled rooftops of Baker Street as he stood by the fire, absently rotating the bowl of his pipe. I found him in his dressing gown, the message's ashes long since removed, but their weight still tangible in the room. "The bishop overreached," Holmes murmured. "In what way?" I asked, stifling a yawn and pouring tea. "His note, the tone. It was theatrical, Watson, deliberately so. He fancies himself a master of narrative. That or he intends to unsettle you." Holmes gave a small smile. "If so, he failed." He tapped the pipe twice against the hearth. "Today we visit the church." "St. Cyprian's?" Holmes nodded. "Where better to find a devil in disguise than in a house of God? St. Cyprian's stood on the edge of Clerkenwell, its Romanesque facade nestled in a wedge of shadow cast by taller neighboring structures. It was an old, brooding edifice, stained with soot and softened with ivy. A solitary bell tolled above as we approached, its sound flat against the morning mist. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and wax. A sexton, bent with age and half-deaf, showed us into the nave without question. Holmes observed every inch of the pews, floorboards, and pulpit. He paused at the fifth pew from the front on the left side. "This one." He knelt, brushing his fingers along the underside of the wooden bench. "Here, Watson, note the residue of sealing wax." He withdrew a penknife and pried gently beneath the pew's lip. A sliver of folded paper, wedged deep into a crevice, slid out. Holmes opened it. Another instruction. It was short, typewritten. "Thursday, midnight. The delivery shall be made. Same place. Do not linger. B." "That's tonight," I said. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then tonight we wait." We spent the remainder of the day in preparation. Holmes disguised himself as a laborer, donning soot-blackened garments and a cap pulled low over his brow. I, less accustomed to such theatricality, followed suit as best I could, outfitted in a coat borrowed from a patient of mine known for night work at the docks. By 11 that evening, we were in place. Holmes had positioned us behind the choir screen of St. Cyprian's, concealed in a niche that offered a full view of the nave and the fifth pew. Midnight neared. The bell began to chime. 12 resonant tones. And then the door creaked. A figure entered. Tall, slender, with the unmistakable silhouette of clerical garb, he moved like one who belonged in such places, not with reverence, but with familiarity. Holmes's grip on my arm tightened. The man reached the pew, knelt briefly, then slipped a small parcel beneath the bench. He rose and began to leave. Holmes surged forward. "Hold it there!" The man turned sharply and bolted. We gave chase, out through the nave, down the side aisle, and into the darkened vestibule. The fugitive turned left into the courtyard, but Holmes, anticipating the move, sprang from the corner and tackled him against a stone column. The man let out a strangled gasp. Holmes drew back the clerical collar. "Not a priest," he muttered. "A costumer's stitch. Clever." The man was pale, young, no older than 30, with wild eyes and an ink-stained thumb. "I'm not the bishop," he rasped. "Then tell us who is." The man wheezed. "You don't understand. He's not just a man. He's an idea." Holmes scowled. "Ideas do not leave typewritten threats." The man laughed, bitter and short. "He'll know you took me, and he'll respond." Holmes glanced at me. "Take note, Watson. Every fanatic eventually reveals the shape of his god." We brought the man, whose name turned out to be Elias Trent, to Lestrade. He confirmed Caleb Fry's story, describing the underground network of pamphleteers with reverence, as if part of a sacred mission. "The bishop's words, they were gospel to us," he confessed. "He spoke of truth unchained, of fire in the veins of England. We printed by candlelight. We distributed on foot. We never questioned his orders." "What of the death of Rigg?" Holmes asked. Trent looked away. "I didn't know, truly, but if he had betrayed us, the bishop would not have hesitated." Lestrade snorted. "And what of this same place mentioned in the note?" "A warehouse off Greaves Street, near the old biscuit factory." The following night, we returned to Greaves Street with Lestrade and a pair of plainclothes constables. The warehouse loomed like a derelict shipwreck, its windows boarded, its iron door chained. Inside, beneath a row of extinguished gas lamps, we found the press. A newer model than the one at Pickering and Sons. Compact, mobile. "It's not just sedition," Lestrade muttered. "It's espionage." Holmes crouched near a stack of printed sheets. "It's both," he said, lifting a flyer. "This isn't merely criticism. It's coded messaging." I peered at the flyer. "To whom?" Holmes's face was grave. "To agents. Abroad." We secured the warehouse and its contents, but the bishop himself remained elusive. Holmes stood alone before the silent press, fingers trailing the steel frame. "He watches still," he said softly. I approached. "We'll find him, Holmes." He nodded. "Yes, but on his stage, not ours. This is more than murder now, Watson. It is performance, and we have not yet reached the second act." Chapter 4. Embers Beneath the Ink. A cold drizzle swept across London as Holmes and I departed the warehouse at Greaves Street, our boots echoing against the slick cobblestones. The scent of machine oil and charred ink still clung to our coats. Holmes remained unusually quiet during our return to Baker Street, his gaze distant, as though calculating an invisible equation. Back at our lodgings, he collapsed into his armchair, fingers templed beneath his chin. "We are no longer chasing a murderer, Watson," he said. "We are engaged with an architect, one who builds shadows." "You believe the bishop's ultimate aim lies beyond the pamphlets?" "I am certain of it." Holmes rose and crossed to the desk. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a portfolio stuffed with clippings, correspondence, and ledgers. "I've been tracking similar agitprop for over a year. Disparate pieces, disconnected on the surface. Strikes, street sermons, academic tracts, but always the same metaphors. Fire, awakening, blindness lifted." "And you think the bishop is the common thread?" Holmes nodded. "He's moving toward something. Inciting disorder to mask a singular objective, the murder of young Rigg was the first overt sign." Before I could respond, a knock sounded. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, read, and frowned. "Mr. Holmes? Urgent. Another death. Printers' Row. Come discreetly." Inspector Lestrade. Holmes tucked the message into his coat. "Another corpse. Come, Watson." The curtain rises again. Printers' Row was a narrow street off Cheapside, littered with spent cartridges of ink and the smell of damp paper. The shopfront in question belonged to Wexley and Bright, an old firm that once printed legal notices and theater bills. Lestrade met us inside, standing grimly beside a corpse slumped over a compositor's frame. The victim was older than Rigg, mid-40s, with hair speckled white and cheeks sallow. Blood had pooled beneath his stool. "Cause of death?" Holmes asked. "Blow to the head," Lestrade said. "Blunt object. No signs of struggle, though. He was struck while seated." Holmes studied the surroundings, neat stacks of lead type, an overturned mug, a single sheet still locked into the press. He approached the page and examined it closely. "This line here," he murmured. "O sleeper, awake! The flame is kindled anew." "Another pamphlet?" I asked. "A sermon, veiled but unmistakably from the bishop's hand." Holmes rifled through the drawers beneath the compositor's bench and retrieved a ledger. "Ah!" he said. "Here is the key." He opened the book to a bookmarked page and held it up. The printer had been tracking commissions, each paid in cash. Here, 3 orders signed only as B. Note the recurrence of odd timing, midnight deliveries, urgent turnarounds. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "There's a 4th entry here." Holmes nodded. "Dated this week. He was still active, and someone silenced him." Later that afternoon, Holmes and I returned to the British Library to consult the archives. There, under flickering gaslight and amidst the scent of ancient vellum, Holmes located several of the bishop's earlier tracts. "They began as ideology," he noted, spreading them across the table. "But over time, the language shifts, from illumination to purification, from awakening to necessary destruction." "A radicalization? Yes. And here's something else. Observe the typesetting. The font and kerning match exactly with Fry's first pamphlet. But these?" Holmes pointed to a later leaflet, printed with a different hand, a different press. Meaning the bishop changed stations? Or grew his operation, and each press master he corrupted became another liability. I sat back, frowning. "Then the body count will rise." Holmes didn't answer. His eyes had drifted beyond the text, beyond the room, into the gears of some unseen machine. The next morning brought a visitor, a nervous, ink-stained woman who introduced herself as Miss Clara Lanchester, once an apprentice to the deceased compositor at Wexley and Bright. I know I shouldn't be here," she said, eyes darting to the window. "But I believe Mr. Bright was about to go to the police. He'd been anxious for weeks, said there were messages in the margins." "Messages?" Holmes's voice was calm. "In the pamphlets, not just the content, literal margin notes, fleeting phrases, sometimes a single line. 'Brace yourself, new fire, ready the door.'" "Did he tell anyone else?" "No, sir, just me. He trusted me." Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "Watson, Miss Lanchester has just handed us the bishop's lexicon." We took the pamphlets back to Baker Street and examined them with magnifiers and lamplight. True to Clara's word, the margins were littered with faint italic script, phrases embedded between symbols, flourishes in the typeface almost imperceptible without trained eyes. Holmes jotted down each phrase and their associated dates. Chronological, almost like liturgical notes. Observe, they're building toward something. He began to rearrange the lines. "Awake the sleeper. Forge the new dawn. Cleanse the street. Open the vault. Deliver the fire." "Cleanse the street," I muttered. "Fleet Street?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly. And open the vault, possibly a target. Vault as in bank or archive. Perhaps even crypt." At that moment, a knock rattled the door. Lestrade again, breathless and soaked. "There's been a break-in," he said. "St. Bride's Church, off Fleet Street. The crypt was ransacked. Nothing taken, but the altar stone was split." Holmes stood abruptly. "The bishop has begun his final sermon." Chapter 5, The Whisper of Stone and Flame. The crypt beneath St. Bride's Church exuded the chill of centuries. As Holmes and I stepped beneath its low archway, Lestrade's lantern cast grotesque shadows upon weathered masonry and carved cherub faces worn featureless by time. The altar stone lay in 2 jagged halves, split cleanly as though with a mason's chisel. Dust still clung to the edges. Holmes knelt before it, tracing the break with his gloved fingers. "No tools left behind?" Lestrade shook his head. "Not a trace. Whatever they used, they brought in and out under cover of darkness. The vicar says nothing has been disturbed. The crypt is mostly symbolic now, no valuables." Holmes stood, eyes narrowing. "Symbolism is precisely the point." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The bishop is sending a message. Every act is performance, Watson. He splits an altar not for gain but for gravitas." I gestured toward the cracked floor. "And the vault beneath?" "Empty," said Lestrade. "Old ossuary. Closed since the plague years." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Which means it's the perfect place for a meeting." Back at Baker Street, Holmes began pacing, occasionally dictating as I transcribed from our growing collection of marginal phrases and their coded locations. Observe, he said. Each message points to a progression: spiritual, geographic, strategic. He tapped the paper. Cleanse the street, let us hear. Open the vault has now occurred. The next instruction? He pointed to the latest line Miss Lanchester had discovered. Bring forth the ember. Ember, I repeated. Another metaphor? Or a name, possibly a person. Before I could question further, a commotion arose below. Moments later, Clara Lanchester burst into our sitting room, face pale, coat soaked. They've taken Mr. Pickering, she gasped. Taken? Snatched from his home in Lambeth. I was delivering proofs. There was blood on the stair, a pamphlet nailed to the door. Holmes took the leaflet from her trembling hand. It bore only one phrase. The final sermon nears. One must be sacrificed. By dusk, we were in Lambeth. The Pickering home was ransacked, drawers overturned, proofing plates scattered. Lestrade was already on scene. Same fingerprints as the warehouse door, he said. 3 men seen fleeing north, but they vanished in the alleys. Holmes paced the sitting room, examining ink stains, footprints, and strands of flaxen paper twine. His attention lingered on a brass clock knocked from the mantel. This clock was broken deliberately, he murmured. The hands stopped at 3:17. A code? Perhaps. Or a meeting time. I frowned. Where? Holmes turned the clock over and extracted a torn receipt wedged into the backplate. Look here, Bishop's Folly, 3 a.m. Tuesday. Bishop's Folly? A tavern. Dockside. Used to be an opium den. Now caters to smugglers and agitators. Holmes tucked the slip into his coat. They're staging the final sermon there. That night, we made our way to the tavern through a choking fog that rolled off the Thames like a living shroud. Bishop's Folly crouched at the edge of the water, its eaves sagging, windows shuttered, but light pulsed behind the cracks. Holmes motioned to a side entrance and we crept through, emerging into a dim storage cellar. From above came the low murmur of voices. We ascended the servants' stairs and peered through a slatted door. Inside were a dozen men, some masked, others visibly nervous. At the center stood a tall figure draped in gray robes and a wide-brimmed hat. He stood atop a crate, one gloved hand raised. The flame is ours, he intoned. London sleeps, blind to its rot, but we shall kindle the dawn. Holmes whispered, That voice, it's not a priest, it's theatrical. Trained. I know it. He nudged the door open. The figures turned. Clara's gasp behind me gave us away. Go, the bishop shouted. Chaos erupted. The lights were doused. A gunshot rang out. Holmes lunged, grappling with a fleeing figure. Watson, after the others! I gave chase through the smoke-filled hall, tackling one man before he reached the rear alley. Lestrade's men poured in from the street. In the end, half were arrested. The rest vanished into the night. Holmes returned, coat torn, hair askew. He slipped through again, but not empty-handed. He opened his hand to reveal a velvet ribbon stained with wax. The bishop left his mark. But next time, we'll leave ours. As dawn broke over the city, Holmes stood at our window, his silhouette long and still against the rising sun. We've torn away the veil, Watson, he said softly. What lies beneath is no longer mere sedition. It is a creed born in ink and lit by fire. I nodded, exhausted. But how do you fight a ghost in the printing press? Holmes turned, eyes alight. With truth, yes, but also with cunning. And now at last, we know his theater, his actors, and his stage. He held up a half-burned pamphlet recovered from the tavern floor. The bottom edge bore a new signature, Vox Tenebris. The voice of darkness, Holmes translated. He has named himself. I felt a chill pass through me. Then he intends to be heard. Holmes smiled grimly. Let us hope he enjoys being answered. Chapter 6. The Raven's Ledger. Holmes's mood turned more grim than I had seen in weeks. It was not merely the bishop's escape that darkened his countenance. It was the name he had left behind. Vox Tenebris, the voice of darkness. Holmes paced before our fireplace like a restless shade, puffing his pipe with short, sharp tugs, the air turning thick with blue-gray smoke. I've seen that phrase before, he muttered, but not in connection with any seditious pamphlet. No, this predates the bishop. Predates, I echoed, leafing through our notes. How far back are we speaking? 17 years, Holmes said. An old ledger, a peculiar one, an estate auction in Whitechapel, a collection of manuscripts purchased anonymously, the symbol of a raven stamped upon the spine. I frowned. Surely you're not suggesting the bishop's ideology has roots that deep? Not ideology, Watson. Influence. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. "A gentleman, sir. He insists." Holmes took the card and read it. Ah, he would. I leaned over. "Sir Roderick Hallows, chairman of the Royal Society of Printers, and a collector of dangerous ideas." Sir Roderick arrived moments later, an imposing figure in a frock coat of midnight blue, his beard immaculately trimmed, his gloved fingers curled around a polished cane. "You've stirred quite the hornet's nest, Mr. Holmes," he said, taking a seat without invitation. "Not my intention, Sir Roderick, but unavoidable, given recent activities beneath your society's notice." Sir Roderick offered a tight smile. "Or perhaps not beneath our notice, but beyond our jurisdiction. We are, after all, a guild of craftsmen, not constables." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps you can tell me who Vox Tenebris is." "I cannot." "Will not?" The smile faded. "Let us say only this. The name has appeared before on rogue pamphlets, anonymously funded presses, even certain foreign tracts that found their way past the censor. Always the same raven seal, always unsigned, save for that one phrase." "And you never thought to trace the source?" Sir Roderick's silence was telling. Holmes changed tack. "You purchased a ledger at auction in '73, a collection of typeface sketches, hand-bound. Do you still have it?" "I do." "I would like to see it." Sir Roderick rose. "Very well, but I warn you, Holmes, some ideas, once read, cannot be forgotten." The Royal Society of Printers occupied a grand townhouse in Holborn, filled with the scent of linseed oil and the quiet murmur of movable type. Sir Roderick led us to the archive room, unlocked a tall cabinet, and removed a leather-bound tome no larger than a folio. The cover bore the imprint of a black raven. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside were designs, elaborate typographic forms, cipher alphabets, radical slogans rendered in artistic flair. But it was the back pages that drew his attention. "They're notes," I said. "In Latin?" Holmes translated aloud. "The word is fire. The press is the torch. Ink shall stain the tyrant's throne." He closed the book. The bishop didn't invent Vox Tenebris. He inherited it. Later that night, Holmes sat cross-legged on the rug, the ledger open before him, the fireplace casting flickering light across his features. "Watson, this is no simple pamphleteers' vendetta. This is the revival of a movement, possibly even a cult, hidden beneath the scaffolding of free speech, weaponizing print." He jabbed his finger on a phrase near the spine. "Il Corvo." Italian, the raven. This predates the English documents, European in origin. He reached for a directory of foreign printing guilds. If Vox Tenebris exists now, then Il Corvo was its prototype. By morning, we had our next lead. A ship, recently arrived from Naples, had delivered unmarked crates to a dockside warehouse known to be frequented by former revolutionaries. Holmes and I visited under pretense of inquiring about a missing parcel. The warehouse foreman, a wiry man named Vincenzo with ink-black fingers, recognized Holmes immediately. "You look for trouble, yes?" he said, laughing nervously. "Not at all," Holmes replied. "Just a shipment, possibly filled with books. Or perhaps fire." The foreman's smile faltered. "No books here." Holmes turned to a stack of crates near the wall. "Then you won't mind if I open one." Before the man could object, Holmes had pried off the lid. Inside were reams of paper, finely pressed, watermark bearing the raven seal. "Smuggled in, just as I thought," Holmes said. "Watson, see the footer?" Printed faintly at the bottom of the page. "Speak as shadow. Print as flame." We returned to Baker Street with samples in tow. Holmes placed them beside the bishop's earlier flyers. The fonts matched precisely. So did the phrasing. "It's an international operation," he said, "and the bishop is not its leader, only its London voice." A knock interrupted us. It was Lestrade, looking unusually disheveled. "There's been another fire. Fleet Street, the Northcote building." We arrived to find the facade blackened, firemen still dousing embers. Northcote housed several periodicals, among them the Free Clarion, a liberal journal often critical of state policy. Inside, Holmes sifted through ashes until he found a twisted hunk of brass, a typesetter's signature stamp. "This was arson," he said, "but not just for destruction. This was a silencing." A constable approached with a half-burned page. Holmes accepted it with tweezers. The ink was smudged, but the headline was legible. "The Bishop Unmasked? Evidence of Internal Conspiracy." Below a byline, "Percival Witt. He tried to expose them," I murmured. Holmes's face darkened, and paid for it. That night, we followed the trail to Witt's flat in Kensington. It was dark. No signs of movement. Holmes jimmied the lock and we entered cautiously. Papers were everywhere. Drafts, notes, names, some crossed out, others underlined. In the fireplace, scraps of burned correspondence. Holmes retrieved one fragment, the ink still visible. To vox tenebris. I have fulfilled my role. Do not seek me further. I scanned the room. He feared them, perhaps tried to defect. No, Holmes replied. He was a plant, one of them, but when he tried to bring it down from the inside. He didn't finish the thought. Later, Holmes spread the remaining evidence on our table. There's a cipher in the initials, he said. The printer marks, footers, typesetter colophons, they form a pattern. He pointed to a series of letters, RC, DM, LH, ST, initials of printers or cells. We match them to their known locations and we may uncover the entire network. But we still don't know the bishop's identity. Holmes's eyes glittered. Not yet, but we've narrowed the theater, and tomorrow we pull the curtain. Chapter 7, The Smoke Beneath the City. The fetid breath of the underground curled up through the grates of Ludgate Hill as Holmes and I descended once more into the city's lesser-seen arteries. It was a cold morning, made colder by the knowledge of what we sought. The remnants of the Vox Tenebris printing syndicate, now driven to shadow by our pursuit. Holmes had spent the previous evening in his study with the ledger Elias Trent had tried to destroy. I watched as he deciphered it with the patience of a scholar and the precision of a surgeon. Its contents, encoded in a cipher based on a modified Caesar shift, revealed the distribution routes, payment ledgers, aliases, and, most disturbingly, the locations of cellars. These were underground nodes of activity, part pressroom, part safe house, and part staging ground. Do you know what this is, Watson? Holmes asked, spreading the crumbling pages across the map of London. Evidence of a conspiracy. Yes, but more than that. This is theater. The Vox Tenebris has choreographed this network like an opera, rehearsed, timed, and performed for a very specific audience. Whom do they perform for? Foreign eyes. The ledger mentions phrases like observers in the east and echoes beyond the channel. These documents are not meant merely to incite the working class. They are also meant to signal. Espionage? Not mere espionage. Propaganda as currency. Disinformation as diplomacy. And so, that morning, we ventured to the location marked in the ledger simply as the Crucible. Beneath Fleet Street itself, through an old access point to the Fleet Ditch now sealed in municipal records, we found a rusted stairwell leading into the dark. Holmes led, lantern in hand, his footfalls careful against the slick stone. The chamber at the bottom was larger than expected, vaulted, circular, and lined with niches carved into the brickwork. The remnants of a printing press stood in the center, disassembled but not destroyed. Ash coated the floor. There had been a fire, intentional and controlled, evidence purged, but not perfectly. Holmes crouched near a half-burned crate and withdrew a singed folio. He flipped it open. An address, he said. A recipient's ledger. Weekly deliveries to multiple private clubs across the city. These weren't pamphlets for the masses. They were documents of influence. Political essays. Scandal exposés. Likely doctored. I frowned. Used to sway votes? Or compromise key figures? It would seem the bishop's reach extended into the drawing rooms of Mayfair as well as the tenements of Clerkenwell. Holmes stepped to the wall, pressing against a section of mismatched brick. With a groan, a hidden panel swung inward. Behind it, a narrow corridor led deeper beneath the street. We followed it into the dark. The corridor led to another chamber, this one less prepared for our eyes. Stacks of correspondence, barrels of ink, boxes of unbound paper. But the most damning object was what sat in the center of the room. A new press, recently constructed and partially operational. Still in use, I murmured. Holmes studied the markings. German manufacture. Smuggled in, perhaps. This was no provincial operation. Footsteps sounded above us. Holmes motioned to the shadows, and we took cover behind a stack of crates. A door opened at the far end of the chamber. A lantern flickered. Two men entered, one slight and hunched, the other tall and cloaked. They spoke in hushed tones, but we caught the words. Tonight's dispatch is to go through Dover. The steamer leaves at dawn. And the replacement for Elias? Already chosen. He will speak at the theater next week. Holmes's eyes met mine. He gestured for silence. The men approached the press, placing bundles of printed material onto the work table. The bishop wants all traces removed after tomorrow. He believes the net is closing. He's right. With that, the men turned and exited. Holmes waited a beat, then stood. We must move fast, he said. This theater appearance, it's a rally. A public performance, likely to draw their inner circle. It may be the only time the bishop himself emerges. And what of these? I gestured to the bundles. We take samples, then we burn the rest. We did so swiftly, with oil from a cracked lamp and a match from Holmes's coat. The fire spread through the chamber with furious hunger. We escaped through the corridor just as the flames roared into the press. By morning, Lestrade had joined us at Baker Street, his face drawn with fatigue and astonishment as Holmes laid out the details. "You're certain this rally is next Thursday?" he asked. "Beyond doubt," Holmes replied. "The theater in question is the Chiaroscuro, recently reopened and under new management." Lestrade snorted. "Sounds like a place for ghosts." "Precisely." Holmes tapped the ledger. "It's not merely symbolic. The Chiaroscuro has a history of housing radical performances under the guise of satire. The bishop is playing to an audience both literal and political." Lestrade leaned back. "What do you propose?" Holmes smiled grimly. "A play of our own, one in which the curtain falls on the bishop." The week leading to the rally was spent in frantic preparation. Lestrade coordinated with the Home Office to plant agents in the theater's staff and secure exits. Holmes and I immersed ourselves in the archives, studying every reference to the Chiaroscuro and its patrons. We uncovered names that surprised even Lestrade, peers of the realm, editors, officers. "All the world's a stage," Holmes muttered one night, "but some stages are made of tinder." Thursday arrived. The Chiaroscuro Theater sat like a great maw in the alley off Gray's Inn Road. Its gas lamps flickered as a crowd formed at dusk. Men in thick overcoats, women with veiled hats, and others who bore the dress of dock workers and radicals, a melting pot of the city's discontent. Holmes and I took our place in a private box overlooking the stage. Lestrade and his men were posted in the wings and rear gallery. The play began, a farce mocking Parliament. But it was mere prelude. At the conclusion of the first act, the lights dimmed further. And then he came. Dressed in a cloak of midnight blue, a mask covering his upper face, the bishop stepped into the light. The audience hushed. "My friends," he intoned, "we gather not for theater, but for truth." Gasps and murmurs. He raised a pamphlet. "This government has poisoned your bread, shackled your voice, and buried your brothers. Tonight, we answer." The crowd roared in approval. Holmes turned to me. "Now." He rose, stepping to the railing. "Ladies and gentlemen." Holmes's voice cut through the room. "The performance is over." Pandemonium erupted. Lestrade's men poured in from the aisles. The bishop turned, attempting to flee through the wings, but Holmes was faster. He vaulted the railing and landed before the fugitive. They collided in the wings, and Holmes tore away the mask. A gasp rippled through the room. It was not a man unknown to us. "Charles Weatherby," Holmes said. "Editor, patriot, murderer." Weatherby struggled, snarling. "You do not understand what I've done." "Oh, I understand," Holmes replied. "You've turned discontent into currency and ink into blood." Lestrade clamped cuffs on the man. And so ended the reign of the bishop. Later, as dawn broke over a quieter Fleet Street, Holmes and I walked alone. "You suspected Weatherby early," I said. "I suspected the mind behind the mask," Holmes replied. "Only one with his influence and rhetoric could orchestrate such a theater of revolution." And yet he hid in plain sight, as do all performers, until the final bow. Chapter 8. The Riddle of the Iron Mask. The fog of the early morning clung to the streets of London as Holmes and I made our way through the winding alleys of Soho. The city, still half asleep, lay in quiet expectation, as though awaiting the final act of a drama that had lasted far too long. The arrest of Charles Weatherby, the man behind the mask of the bishop, had caused a stir in London's intellectual circles. He had been the architect of a web of seditious pamphlets, revolutionary ideals, and clandestine meetings that threatened to upend the political balance of the nation. The bishop's true identity, once revealed, shattered the illusion of the movement he had built. Yet Holmes had been quick to point out that while Weatherby was a master of the public spectacle, the true threat remained hidden in the shadows. "What do you think, Holmes?" I asked, glancing at him as we walked. "Now that the bishop is behind bars, is it truly over?" Holmes's eyes, sharp and calculating as always, remained fixed on the path ahead. "Over? Hardly, Watson. The bishop was but a symbol, a leader who rallied the discontented masses. But the force behind him was not just ideology. It was organization. And that organization is still out there. I sighed, feeling a weight settle over me. You mean the others? The ones who helped him? Exactly. They are the true architects of this conspiracy, and they will not be easily undone. Weatherby may have been their figurehead, but the machinery of the movement is far more intricate, and it is still turning. The faint sound of bells chimed in the distance, signaling the hour. We were nearing the site of our next lead, a warehouse on the edge of Soho, where a mysterious figure known only as the Alchemist was rumored to be operating. This enigmatic individual had been mentioned in Weatherby's ledgers, though very little was known about them. The Alchemist was said to be a master of disguise, able to weave illusions and manipulate people's perceptions to suit his needs. Holmes had been intrigued by the name. An alchemist, he had mused the night before as we pored over the notes from our investigation. A person who deals in transformations, of metals, of lives, of identities. It is an apt title for someone who specializes in the art of misdirection. I had been skeptical at first, thinking that perhaps Holmes's mind was beginning to run away with itself. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The bishop, after all, had been a master of disguise himself. Could it be that the alchemist was a member of his inner circle, perhaps even the one who had engineered the complex network of false identities and coded messages? We arrived at the warehouse, its exterior unremarkable, but its atmosphere charged with a strange sense of urgency. The street was quieter here, the buildings taller and more foreboding, as though the shadows themselves had gathered to watch us. Holmes led the way, his pace quick but measured. We were not alone. Lestrade had sent a few constables to keep watch from a discreet distance, and they were positioned around the building, ready to assist if necessary. Holmes approached the door with a single, deliberate knock. The sound echoed through the quiet alleyway, swallowed by the fog that clung to everything. A moment passed before a figure appeared at the door. A man, short and wiry, with a face half obscured by a hood. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and cautious. "We are looking for someone," Holmes replied, his voice calm but firm. "The alchemist." The man's eyes narrowed, but he did not step aside. "You've come to the wrong place, gentlemen. There's nothing here for you." Holmes's gaze flicked to the side. He did not speak immediately, but I could tell from the slight tightening of his jaw that he was already processing the situation. His mind was working, calculating every possible angle. "You misunderstand," Holmes said finally. "We are not here to threaten anyone. We simply need to speak with the alchemist." The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. After a long moment, he stepped back from the door, pulling it open just enough for us to enter. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of chemicals and damp wood. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with various bottles, jars, and strange implements, many of which I could not immediately identify. Holmes did not flinch. His eyes darted across the room, taking in every detail, as he led us further inside. The man who had opened the door trailed behind, keeping a cautious distance between us. Finally, we reached the far end of the warehouse, where a large table was covered in papers, strange diagrams, and half-finished experiments. In the center of the table stood a figure, a tall man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He wore a long coat that hung loosely about him, and his hands were stained with what appeared to be ink. "The alchemist," Holmes said, his voice smooth as silk. "I presume?" The man did not flinch at the mention of his name. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying us with a calculating gaze. "You have come looking for answers," the alchemist said, his voice low and even. "But answers are not always as they seem." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "You are part of a much larger puzzle, I believe. Weatherby was only a small piece, an instrument for your design. The real question is, what was the true purpose of all of this?" The alchemist smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Purpose? Purpose is a luxury for those who believe they can control it. In the world I live in, purpose is something you take, something you forge from the chaos around you." I could feel Holmes's interest peak. "Chaos is a tool, then?" The alchemist's smile widened slightly. "Indeed, Chaos is the medium through which I work. I am a creator, a manipulator of reality itself. You see, my dear detectives, the world you think you understand is but an illusion. People believe in structure, in order, but beneath that veneer is something far more fluid. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed the alchemist's words. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the analysis happening behind those sharp, calculating eyes. You've been hiding in plain sight, Holmes said, his voice now laced with a quiet intensity, and you've been manipulating people's perceptions, using illusions and false realities to hide the truth. The alchemist raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by Holmes's deduction. Indeed, it's a delicate art, creating the illusion of something while concealing the truth behind it. And what is the truth? Holmes asked. The alchemist's eyes darkened. The truth is that all of this, the bishop, the pamphlets, the revolutions, it was never about politics. It was always about something far greater, something that no one else could see. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. And now, you've come to understand it. But I wonder, are you ready to? I glanced at Holmes, who appeared deep in thought. It was clear that this conversation was far from over, but it seemed we had finally arrived at the crux of the mystery. Whatever game the alchemist had been playing, it was far more dangerous and far more complicated than we had ever imagined. Then show us, Holmes said, his voice low and measured. The alchemist smiled, the expression cold and calculating. You think you are ready, Sherlock Holmes? Very well. But remember this, some puzzles are never meant to be solved. He turned away, moving toward a table covered with papers. As he gestured for us to follow, I could not help but wonder just how far this web of intrigue stretched, and whether we were now too deeply entangled to escape. The alchemist gestured toward the cluttered table, and with an unsettling calm, he began to arrange several sheets of paper before us. Each paper was covered in strange symbols, cryptic messages, and elaborate diagrams that seemed to swirl and twist like some kind of visual code. I could feel my mind straining to make sense of it, but the more I studied, the more confusing it became. Look carefully, the alchemist said, his voice growing softer, more insistent. This is not just a game of politics, of pamphlets, or of revolutions. This is about control over the very perception of reality itself. Holmes leaned in, examining the diagrams with the sort of intensity I had come to expect from him in moments of great focus. And what exactly are these? Ciphers? The alchemist chuckled, but there was no mirth in the sound. Ciphers, yes, but also much more. These are the workings of a deeper mechanism, a mechanism that controls the hearts and minds of men. What is truth, Holmes? What is reality? If you can manipulate what people believe to be true, you can control everything. That is the real power. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could sense the wheels in his mind turning. And you believe this is what the bishop wanted? To manipulate perception on such a grand scale? The alchemist's lips curled into a thin smile. The bishop was merely a pawn, a distraction. He believed in a cause, but the true cause is far greater. He was being used, as are all the others. The truth lies beneath the surface, in the hidden currents that guide the world. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. And you? What is your role in all of this? The alchemist's smile deepened. I am the creator of these currents. I am the one who shapes the narrative. The bishop, the pamphlets, the underground movements, they are all part of the narrative I have carefully crafted. They are necessary to maintain the illusion, to keep the world turning the way I want it to. Holmes remained silent for a moment, studying the papers with an almost surgical precision. This is madness, he muttered, more to himself than to the alchemist. You are suggesting that all of this, every revolution, every act of violence, was orchestrated by you? Not by me alone, the alchemist replied smoothly, but by a network, a group of like-minded individuals who understand the power of perception. The revolutionaries you've been chasing, the anarchists, the radicals, they are all part of a carefully constructed narrative. They believe they are fighting for a cause, but they are simply pawns in my grand design. Holmes looked up sharply. You think you are the master of this world, but you are not. You are playing with fire, and it will consume you just as it has consumed all those who've tried to control others through fear and manipulation. The alchemist's smile faltered for just a moment, and I caught a brief glimpse of something darker in his eyes, something ancient and twisted. "You think you can stop me, Holmes? You are just a man. A brilliant man, yes, but still only a man. You cannot see the full picture. You cannot understand the forces at play." Holmes stood up abruptly, his fingers curling into a fist. "I understand enough to know that your game ends here. You and your network have underestimated us. This will all unravel, just as the bishop's mask was removed, and we will find the others." The alchemist's eyes glinted with amusement, but there was no humor in them. "You think so, do you? Very well, Holmes. But let me leave you with this thought. Some things are too dangerous to be understood. Some secrets are better left buried." Holmes did not reply immediately. He was still studying the papers, his mind racing as it often did when confronted with a puzzle that threatened to break the very boundaries of reason. I could see the depth of his concentration as he sifted through the tangled web of information before him. "I'll take these," Holmes said finally, his voice calm, controlled. "And I will see to it that your carefully constructed illusion is shattered." The alchemist did not seem disturbed by this, though I could tell that there was a deeper, more dangerous game being played here, a game that Holmes had yet to fully comprehend. There was something in the alchemist's words, in his actions, that suggested he was far more than a mere schemer. He was a master manipulator, a figure who seemed to be several steps ahead of us. Holmes turned toward me, the papers clenched tightly in his hand. "Watson, we need to leave. Now." Before I could respond, there was a sudden movement in the shadows behind us, and the alchemist's voice rang out, low and menacing. "You think you can escape me so easily?" His tone was almost mocking, yet there was a chill in it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "This is not over, Sherlock Holmes. You are playing a game you do not understand, and when the pieces fall, you will realize just how deep you've fallen into my web." Holmes's face remained unreadable as he turned to leave, and I followed him closely. But as we reached the door, the alchemist's words hung heavy in the air. "You will never stop me," he said, his voice lingering like a dark omen. The door slammed shut behind us, and I found myself wondering if we had made a grave mistake. Had we truly outsmarted the alchemist, or had we simply walked deeper into his trap? We emerged into the cold night air, and the fog seemed thicker than before, pressing in on us from all sides. Holmes's pace remained steady, but there was an intensity in his movements now, an urgency that suggested he was fully aware of the danger we had just narrowly escaped. "Holmes," I said, my voice tinged with concern. "What now? We cannot let him slip through our fingers." Holmes paused, his eyes distant as he gazed out into the mist. "We follow the threads, Watson. The web he's woven is far too intricate for him to keep hidden forever. We will find the others, and we will stop them." I wanted to believe him. But as I looked at Holmes, standing resolute and unfazed by the peril surrounding us, I couldn't help but feel that we had only just scratched the surface of a much larger, more dangerous mystery. The alchemist had shown us a glimpse of something much darker than we could have ever imagined. And now, the real test was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Puppeteer's Strings. The fog clung to London's streets like a suffocating blanket, weaving through the alleyways and curling around lampposts, shrouding the city in a veil of mystery. Holmes and I had spent the better part of the past 2 days investigating the contents of the alchemist's papers, and yet every answer seemed to lead to more questions. The web of conspiracies, sedition, and manipulation was far more complicated than I had initially believed. I sat at our modest table in Baker Street, scribbling notes from the scribbled remnants of the alchemist's ciphered sheets. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. Holmes was standing by the window, his back turned to me, his silhouette half illuminated by the flickering gas lamp outside. He was deep in thought, though his posture, as always, betrayed little emotion. It was as if he was staring into the very heart of the problem, looking for something that was beyond the reach of mere logic and reason. "What do you think, Watson?" Holmes asked suddenly, without turning. I paused. "About what?" He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Do you think we've reached the end of this trail? Or are we, as I suspect, merely standing at the threshold of a far darker game. I set my pen down and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The alchemist's papers are a riddle. Each clue only leads to another, more perplexing mystery. I can't help but feel that he's testing us, pushing us to unravel a thread that, once pulled, will unravel much more than we expect. Holmes nodded, his face pensive. Indeed. And it seems the alchemist is not working alone. He is but one piece in a much larger puzzle. I agree, I said. But who are these others he mentioned? Who is pulling the strings behind the scenes? Holmes's gaze narrowed, and he stepped away from the window, his mind clearly racing. We will need to follow the money. The money? I asked, confused. Money, Watson, is the lifeblood of any operation, especially one as vast and complex as this. Brett, if we can trace the flow of funds, whether through agents, pamphlets, or coded messages, we may uncover the identity of those who have been manipulating the masses. But how do we start? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Holmes smiled, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. I have a few ideas. Later that evening, we found ourselves at a dimly lit tavern off of Fleet Street, a place I had visited in my earlier days as a young doctor. The local barkeep, a grizzled man named Giles, greeted us with a nod of recognition but said nothing more, knowing full well the nature of our business. Holmes, ever the master of disguise, had donned a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, making him appear less the famous detective and more like a shadow in the corners of a murky world. I had followed suit, dressing in my own dark, nondescript clothing. Giles set 2 pints of ale before us, and Holmes leaned in, speaking in a low voice. We need information. There are certain individuals in this city who move unseen through the underworld. If we are to uncover the true architects of this conspiracy, we need to find out who is financing the alchemist's activities. I took a sip of my ale, considering his words. You think someone here can help? Holmes's eyes glinted. Not here, Watson, but someone close by. I frowned. Who? Old friends, Holmes replied cryptically, standing up with a swift motion. Come. We're not finished yet. We walked through the fog-shrouded streets, our footsteps muffled against the damp cobblestones, until we reached an unassuming building on the outskirts of Cheapside. It was an old warehouse, the windows boarded up, its entrance flanked by 2 menacing-looking figures. They were large, imposing, their faces obscured by shadows, but their posture screamed authority. Holmes didn't pause. He simply walked toward the door with a deliberate confidence. As we approached, one of the men stepped forward, his eyes glimmering with recognition. Holmes, the man said, his voice rough and low. Been a while. Holmes gave a small nod. Barker. Still managing the accounts, I see. Barker's eyes flicked to me, narrowing slightly. Not exactly a business I care to talk about openly. Holmes smiled. Then let's keep this conversation private, shall we? Without waiting for a response, Holmes turned and strode into the building, followed closely by me. The interior was a stark contrast to the bustling life outside. It was dark, silent, and smelled faintly of oil and machinery. We passed through a series of corridors, following Barker's lead until we came to a small office in the back of the warehouse. Inside, the room was cramped and poorly lit, but there was an air of urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. Several men sat around a table, each of them casting wary glances toward Holmes. These were men who did not welcome the intrusion of lawmen or detectives in their midst, and I could tell that my companion's presence here was as much a danger to the group as it was an advantage. I trust you've been well, Barker, Holmes began, his voice calm but firm. Barker gave a gruff nod, as well as one can be in this line of work. What do you want, Holmes? Holmes took a step closer to the table, his gaze flicking briefly over the men gathered there. I need to know who's funding the alchemist's operation. The pamphlets, the underground network, they don't function without money. I need to know where it's coming from. The men exchanged nervous looks, and I could sense the tension in the room. No one spoke for a moment, but then one of the men, a gaunt figure with a hooked nose, spoke up. You don't want to get involved in this, Holmes, he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. There are people at the top who... I don't care about your top people, Holmes interrupted, his tone sharp. I care about facts, names, locations. Barker sighed heavily, rubbing his temple as if this were an inconvenience. You've never been one to back off, have you, Holmes? Holmes smiled. I do try to finish what I start. Barker met his gaze for a long moment, then, without a word, nodded to the man with the hook nose. The man slid a piece of parchment across the table to Holmes. Holmes took it, scanning the names and figures carefully, his eyes flicking back to Barker. "This," Holmes murmured, "is exactly what I needed." Barker gave a reluctant grunt. "We don't know the full story, but these names, these financiers, are tied to the movement. It's not just the alchemist. There's a much larger network operating in the shadows." "But it's dangerous, Holmes. You're in deeper than you think." Holmes stood up, folding the parchment carefully. "I'm aware of the risks, but this isn't just about stopping a conspiracy. It's about uncovering who's been pulling the strings in this city. And once I find out who they are, I'll expose them for all to see." Barker's face darkened, but he said nothing more. As we turned to leave, he called out to Holmes. "Just be careful, Holmes. You're not dealing with amateurs this time." Holmes's lips twisted into a grim smile. "I rarely do, Barker. I rarely do." As we exited the warehouse and once again found ourselves in the cold night air, Holmes seemed more focused than I had ever seen him. He was turning over the information in his mind, his expression unreadable. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice tinged with both anticipation and apprehension. Holmes turned to face me, his eyes burning with a determination I had rarely witnessed. "Now we find the heart of the conspiracy, Watson, and when we do, we will expose it for all to see." I couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt, but I knew there was no turning back now. The alchemist's grip on London, and perhaps far beyond, was growing stronger, and it would take all of Holmes's cunning to see this case through to its bitter end. And yet, as I watched Holmes disappear into the fog ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger was only just beginning. Chapter X, The Devil's Mark. The clock struck midnight once more, its low toll echoing through the empty streets of London like a distant warning. Holmes and I stood at the edge of a shadowed square, our eyes fixed on the looming figure of a building ahead. It was a place I had known well, having passed it countless times in my youth, the headquarters of the clandestine network known as the Rosicrucians. They were a secret society with a reputation for intrigue and mystery, their connections in the highest echelons of government and industry far-reaching and hidden beneath layers of ritual and allegory. But now, under the glimmer of the lamplights, it had become a focal point for something much darker. I could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on my shoulders, as if the very air around us had thickened, thick with the dangers we had uncovered over the past weeks. This was no longer just a case of a haunted printing press or a dead apprentice. There were forces at work far more dangerous than any specter. "Holmes," I whispered, my voice tight with unease. "What are we doing here?" Holmes remained silent for a moment, his sharp gaze unwavering. His eyes glittered in the dim light, scanning the building with the practiced intensity of a man who had long since learned to see beneath the surface. "We're here to find answers, Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "But more importantly, we're here to uncover the man behind it all." I followed his gaze toward the imposing facade of the building. It was old, a relic of the past, with stone pillars flanking a heavy wooden door, its frame etched with intricate symbols I recognized from my earlier studies into the Rosicrucians. But something about it had changed, as though the building had become more than just a place of power. It had become a symbol of something far more sinister. "Holmes, what exactly are we looking for?" I asked, trying to steady my breath. Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, the type of smile that both reassured and unsettled me in equal measure. "We're looking for the source, Watson. The one who controls the flow of money, the one who pulls the strings. The alchemist was only a part of this larger machine." I felt a chill run down my spine. "The one behind the alchemist?" "Precisely." We had made our way to the building discreetly, using the cover of darkness and the winding back alleys to avoid being noticed. Now, standing at the threshold, Holmes seemed to hesitate for a moment, his sharp mind working furiously as he considered the next move. "You're certain this is where we'll find him?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Holmes nodded. "The Rosicrucians have always operated in secrecy, Watson, but their influence is vast. They were behind the pamphleteering, behind the whispers of rebellion. The alchemist may have been their puppet, but someone more powerful orchestrated the entire operation. And you believe that someone is here? Holmes's expression darkened. It's our only lead. He turned to the door, which was already ajar, its creaking hinges barely audible in the stillness of the night. We stepped inside, the air cold and damp, thick with the scent of old parchment and dust. The hall stretched out before us, the walls lined with shelves of books and scrolls, the faint flicker of torchlight casting eerie shadows across the stone floor. As we moved deeper into the building, the silence grew oppressive. Every footstep seemed to reverberate through the ancient stone. Every breath we took felt like a betrayal of the stillness surrounding us. Holmes moved with the quiet grace of a cat, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors. We came to a large door, its frame carved with symbols I could barely comprehend. Holmes paused before it, his hand resting lightly on the handle. "This is it," he whispered, his voice tinged with both excitement and trepidation. "Behind this door lies the heart of the conspiracy." I could feel my pulse quicken as he pushed the door open, and we stepped into the dimly lit chamber beyond. Inside, the room was a vast, cavernous space. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, each shelf filled with tomes, scrolls, and manuscripts, works of alchemy, forbidden texts, and ancient philosophies. At the far end of the room, a large, ornate desk sat beneath a portrait of a man I recognized immediately. The face was stern, the features sharp, the eyes cold with an unsettling intensity. It was the face of someone I had seen only in passing, but whose name haunted the corners of my mind. Elias Blackwood, the leader of the Rosicrucians, the architect of the conspiracy. Holmes took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the portrait as if it were the key to unlocking the entire mystery. "Elias Blackwood," he muttered, "the man who has been pulling the strings all along." I stepped closer, examining the room carefully. It was a place of ritual. That much was clear. Symbols of occult origin were etched into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I could feel the weight of centuries of secrecy pressing down on me, as though the very room itself was alive with hidden knowledge. "Do you think he's still here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "If he is, he will be watching us." Just then, a soft noise broke the silence, a faint creaking sound, as if the floorboards were shifting beneath our feet. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for me to remain silent. He motioned toward the far end of the room, where a darkened alcove lay hidden in the shadows. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the space with the precision of a hawk. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice a mere breath. I followed him, my senses heightened, every instinct screaming at me to be cautious. As we neared the alcove, Holmes stopped and turned to me, his eyes gleaming with an unreadable intensity. "Watson," he said softly, "this is no longer just about uncovering a conspiracy. We've entered the lair of a man who deals in things far darker than politics." I nodded, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" Holmes stepped forward and reached for a hidden latch beneath a stone slab. With a soft click, the slab shifted, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as we descended, the silence more profound. "What lies at the bottom of these stairs, Holmes?" I asked, my voice tense. "The truth," he replied simply, his voice filled with the certainty I had come to rely on. The truth about the man behind the mask. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and Holmes paused, his eyes flicking across the shadowy room before him. It was smaller than the one above, its walls lined with dark tapestries that depicted strange, mystical scenes, rituals, symbols, and signs of alchemy. The room was dimly lit by a few scattered candles, their flickering flames casting long, distorted shadows across the stone floor. At the center of the room, there was a large wooden table, covered in old maps, charts, and papers. Everything seemed to be meticulously arranged, as though someone had been working here recently. Holmes stepped forward, his keen eyes scanning the papers in front of him. "These are the plans," he murmured, his voice low. "The alchemist's operations, the network of seditious pamphleteers, the distribution of underground literature. It's all here." I stepped closer, examining the papers with a growing sense of dread. Among the notes and diagrams, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A series of names, each one carefully written in a fine hand, with markings that seemed to indicate their level of involvement. At the bottom of the page, one name stood out above all the rest. Elias Blackwood. Holmes's finger hovered over the name. "There it is," he said softly, almost to himself. "The puppet master, the one who controls everything. And now, Watson, it's time to confront him." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Are we ready for this?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "We have no choice." Chapter was The Alchemist's Revelation. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls had closed in on us. Holmes stood silently, his eyes fixed on the dark tapestry that adorned the far wall, his face inscrutable. I felt a growing unease, an instinctive sensation that we were on the precipice of something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. I glanced around the chamber. The light from the flickering candles danced on the walls, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. The room, once filled with the eerie quiet of ancient knowledge, now felt alive with an almost palpable energy, as if the very stones beneath our feet were humming with secrets. Holmes took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the tapestry. I followed his lead, my footsteps muffled on the stone floor. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the intricate patterns woven into the fabric. It was a strange design, complex, almost esoteric in its symbolism. It depicted a figure cloaked in shadows, surrounded by spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to represent both the heavens and the earth, with lines converging at the center of the tapestry. "There is much more at play here, Watson," Holmes finally said, his voice low but resolute. "The Rosicrucians are only the surface. The true power behind this conspiracy runs deeper, much deeper." I frowned. "What do you mean? Is there another group involved?" Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already several steps ahead. "The pamphleteers were merely a tool, Watson, a means to an end, but they were never the ultimate goal. The true mastermind is someone, or rather, something, much older." I glanced at the tapestry again, trying to make sense of the patterns. "You think the conspiracy goes back further than we thought?" "Much further," Holmes replied. "This," he gestured to the tapestry, "is a symbol of something older than even the Rosicrucians, a network of power and influence that predates them all. And this symbol is the key." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You're saying this is about something occult?" Holmes didn't respond directly, but his grim expression was answer enough. "The pamphleteers may have been pawns in this game, but the real game is something far more dangerous. There are forces at work here, Watson, forces that have been manipulating events for centuries." I could feel my heart begin to race. The gravity of the situation was starting to weigh on me, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. "What do we do now?" Holmes didn't immediately answer. He moved toward the desk at the center of the room, his steps deliberate and slow. He ran his fingers across the scattered papers, his eyes skimming over the intricate notes and diagrams that filled the surface. The maps, the cryptic writings, the coded messages. It was all part of a much larger plan, one that I still couldn't fully comprehend. And then I saw it. Amid the chaos of papers, a letter lay partially hidden beneath a stack of maps. Holmes picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the words. His expression hardened as he scanned the message. "What is it?" I asked, my voice taut with anticipation. Holmes turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and grim determination. "It's from Elias Blackwood himself." The letter was typed in the same precise script as the previous ones we had encountered. There was no mistaking it for anything else. Holmes held it up, allowing me to read along with him. "To my most trusted follower, you have done well in your pursuit of the truth. The time is near. The final act is about to unfold, and with it, the return of our true purpose. There are those who would seek to stop us, to stop the inevitable. They are nothing more than distractions, obstacles to be swept aside. You must not falter, for soon the earth will tremble and the skies will burn. What we have sought for centuries is within our grasp. Trust in the alchemy of the soul, for it will lead you to your ultimate transformation. The stars are aligning. The great work begins. Do not fail me. B." I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the letter. There was something unmistakably chilling about the words. They spoke of a return, of an ancient purpose that had been hidden for centuries. What was this great work? What did Blackwood mean by the alchemy of the soul? "This is more than just a political conspiracy," I said, my voice shaking. "This is something much darker. A cult, perhaps. Something with rituals and beliefs far beyond our understanding." Holmes nodded, his gaze darkening as he turned the letter over in his hands. The alchemists' obsession with transformation was no mere metaphor. The power they seek is not merely physical, it is spiritual. They are after something far more potent than wealth or influence. This is a quest for ultimate power. I took a step back, the weight of the realization pressing heavily on my chest. But why Fleet Street? Why the printing press? Holmes's eyes flicked toward the desk, his mind working rapidly. The press was the perfect cover. It allowed them to distribute their propaganda, to recruit followers, and to weave a web of influence throughout the city. The pamphlets were not merely political. They were coded messages, leading those in the know toward the greater goal. The press itself is an instrument of transformation, Watson. The printing press is the perfect tool for disseminating their vision. And now, I continued, the pieces slowly falling into place, they're preparing for the final phase. The great work, as Blackwood calls it. Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, though there was no mirth in it. Precisely. But we are not too late, Watson. We still have time to stop them. We left the hidden room with haste, the sense of urgency in the air now palpable. Holmes's mind was already racing, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. I followed him through the winding corridors, my own thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. What had we stumbled upon? What ancient power were we dealing with? As we reached the stairs, I hesitated. "Holmes," I said, my voice unsteady. "How do we stop them? How do we fight something so ingrained in history?" Holmes turned, his gaze sharp and calculating. "We take away their power, Watson. We expose them to the light. We make their secrets public, and in doing so, we strip them of the one thing they covet most, control. Expose them to the light," I repeated. "But how? What if they're too powerful?" Holmes's face softened for a brief moment, and he placed a hand on my shoulder. "The truth, Watson, is the most potent weapon of all. The truth is the one thing they cannot control." We made our way back to Baker Street, the city sprawling out before us, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. The days ahead would be filled with danger, with a battle that was not just for our lives, but for the very soul of London itself. As we sat by the fire, Holmes fell into his customary silence, his thoughts elsewhere. I knew that he was already making plans, already formulating a strategy. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something much darker, something far beyond our understanding. And as the shadows in the room grew longer, I knew that whatever we were about to face would test us in ways we could never have imagined. Chapter 12. Beneath the Surface. The clock on the mantel struck 10 as Holmes leaned back in his chair, the pipe in his hand forgotten. He gazed absently at the fire, his mind deep in thought. I sat across from him, the words of Elias Blackwood's letter echoing in my mind. The great work begins. What could it mean? What were they preparing for? And how could we possibly thwart their plans? I set down my cup of tea, the warmth no longer comforting. I had seen Holmes in many moods, calm, intense, and calculating. But tonight there was a restlessness about him that unsettled me. He had not yet spoken of his plans, but I knew he was already assembling pieces of a puzzle that was far larger than either of us had anticipated. "Holmes," I began, breaking the silence, "you've been quiet for too long. What are we missing?" Holmes didn't immediately respond. His gaze shifted to the fire, then to the darkened window. His mind was a maze, weaving through possibilities. After a long pause, he spoke. "We are dealing with something much older than we expected, Watson. Blackwood's letter is not just a threat. It's a call to action, and if we are to stop them, we must understand their true purpose." I raised an eyebrow. "You believe Blackwood and his associates are preparing for something more than just a political upheaval?" Holmes looked at me, his eyes sharp, filled with determination. "Indeed. What they seek is not merely power or influence. It is something far more dangerous. The great work is an alchemical transformation. It is a ritual, one that promises transcendence. The pamphlets were not just propaganda. They were instructions, each one part of a much larger design. I sat back, the weight of his words sinking in. And what is this great work? What is it they are trying to achieve? Holmes leaned forward, his voice lowering as though he were speaking of something forbidden. They are attempting to create something, someone, immortal. The rituals, the coded messages, even the symbolism in the tapestries and pamphlets, they all point to this singular goal, the power to transcend death. I felt a chill run down my spine. Immortality, I murmured, half to myself. But how? How could they possibly? Through alchemy, Holmes interrupted, his tone now full of conviction. But not the alchemy of metals. No, Watson, this is the alchemy of the soul, of the very essence of life. They seek to transmute the human spirit, to transfer it into a vessel that cannot die. I struggled to wrap my mind around his words. But surely, Holmes, this is nothing but superstition, a ridiculous fantasy. The immortality through alchemy is a notion only found in the realms of myth and legend. Holmes smiled grimly. That is what they want you to believe, Watson, to dismiss it as fantasy. But the truth, as always, is more complicated than we could ever imagine. I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. If Holmes was right, then the stakes had escalated far beyond a simple political conspiracy. This was something far more dangerous, an ancient, occult force operating in the shadows of London, and I feared we were already too late. Where do we begin? I asked quietly. Holmes rose, his face suddenly hardened with resolve. We must trace the alchemical connection. If we can understand the process, the rituals they are performing, then we can stop them before the great work is completed. But where do we start? I asked. The pamphleteers are just the tip of the iceberg. What else could we possibly know? Come, Holmes said, his voice gaining in urgency. There is someone who can help us. Someone who has spent his life studying the occult and alchemy. If anyone knows what Blackwood and his followers are truly after, it is him. Holmes and I made our way to the heart of London, through the fog-laden streets, until we arrived at a small, nondescript building, tucked away on a narrow alley. It was a place that most would pass by without a second glance, but Holmes's eyes were fixed on the door with an intensity that suggested he had been here before. We knocked, and the door creaked open to reveal a tall, gaunt figure standing in the doorway. His pale face was lined with age, and his eyes, though sharp, held a trace of sadness. He was a man who had spent far too many years pondering the dark mysteries of the world. Holmes, the man said in a low, rasping voice, I wondered when you would come. I assume this is urgent. This is Professor Aldridge Watson, Holmes said, introducing the man with a nod. He is an expert in the occult, alchemy, and all matters of esoteric knowledge. If anyone can shed light on the alchemical rituals Blackwood and his associates are attempting, it is he. I extended my hand to the professor, and he shook it firmly. It is a pleasure, Dr. Watson, though I must admit it is rarely a pleasure to be sought out by Holmes for such matters. Aldridge led us inside, where the dim light revealed shelves upon shelves of books, some ancient, others more recent, on the subjects of alchemy, mysticism, and occult practices. The room smelled of old parchment and the faint scent of incense. As we sat, I couldn't help but notice the strange symbols etched into the floorboards and walls, as if the very building itself was steeped in arcane knowledge. Holmes wasted no time. Professor, we need your expertise. We are investigating a dangerous cult led by a man named Elias Blackwood. He is attempting to complete an ancient alchemical process, one that, if successful, could result in the transmutation of the human soul. We need to understand what they are trying to accomplish and how to stop them. Professor Aldridge's expression darkened as he listened. Alchemical transmutation of the soul, he muttered. It is not a new idea. The ancients believed that through certain rituals one could ascend beyond the confines of the physical body, merging with the divine or becoming something. I looked at him in disbelief. You mean to say that this is not a new idea? That people have attempted such things before? Many have tried, Aldridge replied, his voice low and somber. But the path to immortality is not one for the faint of heart. The rituals Blackwood is pursuing are not merely theoretical. They are based on a long-forgotten alchemical manuscript, one that has been lost to time. However, there are others who have followed similar paths. There are accounts of those who sought to transmute their soul into a form that cannot die. Some succeeded, but at great cost, and others, well, some of them became something entirely different. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. And you believe Blackwood is trying to replicate these experiments? Aldridge nodded. He is not the first to try, but he is the most dangerous. The manuscript he possesses contains the final steps, the last key to unlocking the transmutation. If he completes the ritual, there will be no stopping him. He will not just live forever. He will transcend into something otherworldly. Holmes stood up suddenly, his expression steely. Then we must stop him. But we must act quickly. The ritual is nearly complete. We left Professor Aldridge's shop with little more than dread and determination. Holmes, ever the pragmatist, had already begun to formulate a plan. We would need to locate the manuscript and destroy it, along with any records of the ritual. If Blackwood could not complete the ritual, his hopes of immortality would be dashed, and with it, the threat to London. As we walked back through the misty streets of London, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The darkness of the world was closing in around us, and I feared that we were no longer in control of the situation. But I knew one thing for certain. Holmes would not rest until he had solved the mystery, no matter the cost. Chapter 13, The Ritual Unveiled. The night had grown colder, and the mist that had clung to the streets of London like a suffocating blanket seemed even thicker as Holmes and I moved swiftly through the alleys. The urgency of our task was reflected in the quickness of our footsteps, the city around us oblivious to the dangerous game unfolding beneath its surface. Holmes's mind was a whirl of thoughts, his usually calm demeanor now tinged with an intensity that suggested the full weight of what we were facing had finally sunk in. Every piece of the puzzle was now in place, and there was only one step left to take. Stop Blackwood before the final ritual could be performed. The manuscript is key, Holmes muttered, more to himself than to me. Without it, he cannot complete the transmutation. If we can destroy it, we may still have a chance. I nodded, trying to keep pace with him. And the location? Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with determination. It is hidden in plain sight, Watson. Blackwood has always been a man of symbolism. The ritual will be performed at the heart of his operation, St. Cyprian's Church. I froze in my tracks. But that's where we found the first clue. It can't be a coincidence. Exactly. The church is the site of both the occult performance and the sanctuary of their faith. Everything he believes, everything he has worked for, culminates there. It's the perfect place for him to complete the ritual. The manuscript is there, hidden within the church's vaults, protected by his most trusted followers. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation settle in my chest. Then we must act before it's too late. But we need more than just a plan. We need to know exactly what we're walking into. Holmes's lips twisted into a faint but determined smile. We will. We're not walking into the unknown, Watson. Not anymore. We've learned enough to outwit them, I trust. As we neared the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would be no ordinary confrontation. Blackwood was not simply a criminal mastermind. He was a man driven by a fanatic belief in the occult. His followers were as much soldiers as they were devotees, ready to sacrifice everything for his cause. The ritual was not just the key to his power. It was the key to his very identity. Holmes stopped just outside the church's grand iron gates, his keen eyes scanning the area with a practiced precision. His mind was working at full speed, evaluating every possibility, every contingency. "Stay close, Watson," he said, his voice low and firm. "We cannot afford any mistakes." We moved swiftly through the gates, making our way toward the church's main entrance, hidden in the shadows of the towering spires. The church, an imposing Gothic structure, loomed like a silent sentinel in the night. Its ancient stonework seemed to absorb the mist, adding to its already haunting presence. The bells of St. Cyprian's rang out, their sound reverberating through the fog as if marking the passage of time that was quickly running out. We crept through the side door, which had been left ajar as though waiting for us. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and old wood, the flickering candlelight casting elongated shadows that danced upon the walls. The space was eerily quiet, the vastness of the nave overwhelming. The pews were empty, the altar darkened, and the whole place felt abandoned as though it were waiting for something momentous to occur. Holmes led the way, his every step measured and silent, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. I followed closely behind, my breath shallow in the cold, oppressive atmosphere. We passed through the main body of the church and toward the rear, where a narrow staircase led down into the crypts below. "The vaults," Holmes whispered, glancing at me. "They'll be guarded, but we've no time to waste." We descended the stairs, the stone steps cool and damp beneath our feet. The further we went, the more claustrophobic the air became, as though the weight of the church itself were pressing down on us. At the bottom of the stairs, the crypt opened into a cavernous chamber, its high stone ceiling lost in shadows. Rows of stone sarcophagi lined the walls, remnants of long-forgotten souls who had once sought eternal rest. Holmes moved forward, his eyes darting between the sarcophagi and the stone walls. He had been here before, I realized. This was where the manuscript was hidden. Suddenly, a soft sound interrupted the silence, a rustle of movement from the shadows. Holmes immediately froze, his eyes narrowing. "Stay alert," he muttered under his breath, signaling for us to hide behind one of the sarcophagi. We waited in silence as the footsteps grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the tension building with every passing second. And then from the shadows, a figure emerged, clad in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. It was one of Blackwood's followers. Holmes remained still, watching the figure closely. The man moved toward a set of heavy iron doors, which led deeper into the crypt. The doors were intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns, and they seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The follower paused before the door, muttering something under his breath. Holmes's eyes flicked to me, and he motioned for us to move. Quietly, we advanced, taking advantage of the figure's focus on the door. But as we neared, the follower turned abruptly, his hood falling back to reveal a gaunt, pale face. "Who goes there?" he called out, his voice low but authoritative. Before either of us could react, Holmes lunged forward with a speed that belied his usual composed demeanor, knocking the follower to the ground. The man let out a strangled cry, but Holmes quickly clamped a hand over his mouth, pinning him against the cold stone floor. "Stay silent, and you will not be harmed," Holmes hissed, his voice deadly calm. The follower's eyes widened in terror as Holmes loosened his grip enough for him to speak. "What do you want?" the man gasped. "Where is the manuscript?" Holmes demanded, his voice still low but filled with authority. The follower hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to Blackwood and the fear of his captors. Holmes pressed harder, his grip tightening. "I will not ask again," Holmes said. "Where is the manuscript?" The follower's breath came in quick gasps, and finally, he spoke. "It's in the vault, through the door. Only the bishop can open it. You will never stop the ritual. It's too late." Holmes's eyes flashed. "We shall see about that." With a swift motion, he knocked the follower unconscious, rendering him immobile. Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "We must move quickly," he said. "The ritual is nearly complete, and if we fail to stop them now, it will be too late." Together, we approached the iron door, the symbols carved into it seeming to glow faintly in the low light. The air around us was thick with anticipation, as though the very atmosphere knew the stakes of what was about to unfold. Holmes stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of the door. "This is it, Watson," he said softly, more to himself than to me. "We are about to uncover the heart of the mystery." The door creaked open slowly, revealing the inner sanctum, the place where Blackwood had performed his rituals. The chamber beyond was small, but filled with strange, occult paraphernalia: candles, ceremonial daggers, and a large, intricately carved stone altar. At the center of the room, an open book lay on a pedestal, its pages filled with cryptic symbols. Holmes's eyes fell upon it immediately. "The manuscript," he whispered. Before either of us could approach, a voice echoed through the chamber, cold and commanding. "You are too late, Holmes." Chapter 14, The Bishop's Last Stand. The voice was as cold as the stone around us, its very presence causing a shiver to run down my spine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I turned slowly to face the figure standing in the doorway. Tall, cloaked, and impossibly still. His presence filled the chamber, suffocating the air with a palpable sense of dread. Holmes did not flinch, his gaze locked on the newcomer with that trademark intensity I had come to know so well. "I take it you are the bishop?" he asked, his tone even but laced with a thin thread of mockery. The figure chuckled softly, the sound chilling in the silence of the crypt. "Ah, Sherlock Holmes!" Always so quick to cut to the heart of the matter. The voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. "But yes, I am the bishop. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, I am the cause of everything you have pursued. I am the one who has pulled the strings, who has orchestrated every step of your investigation, every clue you followed." The bishop's eyes gleamed with a disturbing mixture of pride and madness. "It is my design you have been walking into all along, Holmes." "Your design?" I echoed, stepping forward. "But why, man? What do you want?" The bishop's eyes turned to me, his smile widening slightly. "Ah, Watson, so dutiful, so loyal to your friend, even in the face of true horror. The truth is simple. I want what every man seeks, power, the ability to bend the world to my will. Through the ritual I am about to complete, I shall ascend beyond human limits. I shall transcend mortality itself." Holmes's eyes never left the bishop. "You're deluded if you think such power exists. You're playing with forces you do not understand." The bishop laughed, a low, rumbling sound. "It is you who do not understand, Sherlock. You see the world in black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. But I have seen beyond. I have touched something far greater than you could ever imagine. The power to see the world as it truly is, to unravel its deepest secrets, to change the course of history." He stepped forward, his cloak swirling around him like a shadow, and moved towards the altar. The manuscript was open before him, its pages filled with cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. "Look at it, Sherlock. Look at the culmination of my work," the bishop said, gesturing to the book. "I have gathered the pieces, collected the rituals, invoked the names. Everything is in place. In a few moments, I will have the power to control not only the fates of men, but the very forces that govern the universe." Holmes's gaze remained unflinching. "You've built this illusion, this myth around yourself, but you're just a man, no different from the rest of us. You cannot transcend your nature." The bishop's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "You don't understand. You cannot understand. This is not just about me. This is about changing the very fabric of existence. I will become a god, Holmes. You will all bow before me." Holmes glanced briefly at me, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, his attention returned to the bishop, his voice cool but laden with steel. "Your delusions will be your undoing. You've underestimated us." The bishop's smile returned, but now it was twisted, malevolent. "You think you can stop me? You're too late. The ritual is already in motion. The last step is upon us." Before either of us could react, the bishop raised his hands in the air, chanting under his breath in a language I did not recognize. The symbols on the manuscript began to glow, the light intensifying until it filled the chamber with an eerie radiance. The candles around the room flickered violently, their flames twisting and warping unnaturally. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Watson, we must stop him now, before he completes the incantation." I stepped forward, but the air around us thickened with an oppressive force. It was as if the very atmosphere had become charged with energy, pressing down on us from all sides. My breath caught in my throat, and I staggered, feeling dizzy and disoriented. The room seemed to spin. Holmes, however, remained composed, his eyes fixed firmly on the bishop. "You cannot control the forces you've unleashed," he called, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "There is always a price to be paid for meddling with such things." The bishop's eyes blazed with an unholy fire. "There is no price for those who are chosen, Holmes. There is only power." With a final cry, he brought his hands down, slamming them onto the open manuscript. A surge of blinding light erupted from the book, and the room seemed to tremble as if the very earth itself had been shaken by an unseen force. I shielded my eyes from the brilliance, but even through my closed lids, I could feel the overwhelming energy pulsing through the air. And then, Just as suddenly as it had come, the light vanished. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought the ritual had succeeded, that the bishop had truly transcended, and we were too late to stop him. But when the haze cleared, I saw the bishop standing motionless, his hands still pressed against the manuscript. His face had drained of color, his eyes wide with shock. "What? What have I done?" he whispered, his voice hollow. He looked around wildly as if expecting something to appear from the shadows. No, it cannot be. Holmes moved swiftly, his feet barely making a sound as he approached the altar. "You have not ascended," he said quietly, his voice devoid of triumph. "You've merely triggered the collapse of your own delusions." The bishop turned to face us, his expression a mixture of confusion and horror. I thought it would work. It was all here. All the pieces. The power. Holmes stepped forward and reached out, grabbing the bishop by the wrist. The bishop recoiled, but Holmes held firm. "You were never meant to control the forces you sought," Holmes said, his voice hard. "This was never about power, Blackwood. It was about fear. You've been feeding on it, using it to build your empire of lies. But now it's over. Your game is finished." The bishop's face twisted in anger, but it was a fleeting emotion. In the end, all that remained was the unmistakable look of someone who had realized the truth far too late. I only wanted to change the world," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wanted to show them. I wanted to show them that there was more, that we were meant for more." Holmes sighed, releasing his grip on the bishop. "You were never meant to be a god, Blackwood. You were a man, no more and no less. And in the end, that was your tragedy." The bishop's shoulders slumped, and he fell to his knees before the altar, the weight of his failure crashing down on him. "I thought I was invincible," he muttered. "I thought I could change everything." "We all have our limits," Holmes replied softly, turning away. "And now you must face the consequences of your actions." I stepped forward, my heart heavy with the knowledge of the suffering that had led this man to this point. "It's over, Blackwood," I said quietly. "You've lost." For a moment, there was no response. The bishop was silent, lost in his own thoughts. And then, with a final, sorrowful glance at the manuscript, he looked up at us. "Yes," he whispered, "it is over." And with that, the echoes of the last ritual faded into the darkness, leaving only the quiet of the crypt and the weight of what had been lost, never to be regained. Chapter Theft: The Final Puzzle. The heavy silence of the crypt lingered like a shadow, its oppressive weight refusing to lift. The bishop, once a man driven by fevered ambition and delusions of grandeur, now sat before us, broken and defeated. He had failed in his pursuit of ultimate power, the ritual he had so carefully orchestrated fizzling out into nothingness. And yet his defeat seemed to carry with it a deeper, more disturbing truth, one that had yet to fully reveal itself. Holmes stood motionless by the altar, his gaze fixed on the now dim manuscript that had played such a central role in the bishop's grand scheme. The air around us crackled with the residual energy of the failed ritual, but it was fading quickly, leaving behind a strange emptiness that settled like dust. I took a step forward, my boots echoing against the stone floor. "Holmes," I said, my voice low and uncertain. "What now? The bishop is finished. The ritual has failed. Should we not leave this place and allow the authorities to take him?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he remained as still as a statue, his keen mind no doubt turning over the countless details of the case. The bishop had already surrendered to the inevitable, his ambition shattered. Yet I could not shake the feeling that there was something more to this. A final piece of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. Holmes's voice broke the silence, cold and calculated. "No, Watson, there is one more thing." I turned toward him, startled. "What do you mean? The bishop is finished. We've stopped him." "There's more at stake here than just Blackwood," Holmes replied, his gaze flickering back to the bishop. His plans were always secondary to something else. His rise to power, his obsession with the occult, it was all a smokescreen, a distraction. I frowned, my confusion growing. "A distraction? From what?" Holmes stepped closer to the bishop, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man who had once been the architect of chaos. "From the real mastermind behind all of this." The bishop looked up at Holmes, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about? I am the one who—" "No," Holmes interrupted, cutting him off. You were merely a pawn in someone else's game, Blackwood. You may have believed that you were the one pulling the strings, but you were being manipulated. The bishop's face twisted in a mixture of anger and confusion. Manipulated? By whom? Who else is there? I alone was the one with the vision, the one who sought to change everything. Someone else has been working behind the scenes, Holmes continued, his voice calm but unyielding. You've been used, Blackwood, and now you're going to tell me everything you know. The bishop's face paled, his lips trembling as if he were struggling to grasp the implications of Holmes's words. No, you're wrong, he whispered, shaking his head. I made the plans. I was the one who... Enough. Holmes snapped. The time for denials is over. I know you've been in contact with someone who has been guiding you, influencing your every move. The bishop swallowed hard, his face contorting in a mixture of fear and reluctance. I didn't want to. His voice faltered, and he looked away, as if unwilling to speak the truth. But Holmes was relentless. Who was it, Blackwood? Who was your true benefactor? The bishop's gaze shifted to the manuscript on the altar, his eyes lingering on the pages that had once promised him godlike power. Slowly he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just about power. It was about control. There is someone else, someone far more dangerous than I ever was, someone who has been watching from the shadows, pulling the strings of this entire operation. Holmes leaned forward, his voice steady. Who? The bishop hesitated, as if the name itself was a heavy burden. His name? His name is Lord Sebastian Kincaid. The name struck me like a bolt of lightning, a jolt of recognition running through my veins. Lord Sebastian Kincaid, an enigmatic figure known to the highest circles of London society, a man whose name had been whispered in the most secretive corners of the capital, a man of vast wealth and influence, a patron of the arts, and it was rumored, a man who dabbled in far darker affairs. Holmes's eyes gleamed with something akin to triumph. Kincaid, of course. I blinked in confusion. But Kincaid is a respected nobleman, Holmes. His name is synonymous with London's elite. How could he? Appearances, Watson, are often deceptive, Holmes replied, his tone low but tinged with excitement. Lord Kincaid has long been a figure of fascination to me. His wealth, his position, his mysterious connections. They've always seemed too perfect, too carefully constructed. And now we know why. The bishop nodded weakly, his voice trembling. Kincaid, he promised me power. He promised me everything I ever wanted. He said that together we could change the world. He said we could... Change the world? I interrupted, still struggling to comprehend what was happening. How? Through the ritual, the bishop murmured. Through the occult knowledge, the secrets we uncovered. He said that by completing the ritual, we could create a new world order, one where he would be the true ruler, and I... The bishop's voice broke, and he looked up at Holmes, his expression one of pleading. I was just a tool, a means to an end. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his mind clearly racing. And now the truth is revealed. Lord Kincaid used you as a pawn, Blackwood. He never cared for your ambitions. You were simply a stepping stone in his plan. The bishop lowered his head, unable to meet Holmes's gaze. He promised me everything, but now I see it. I was just a fool. Holmes turned away from the bishop and began pacing the chamber, his mind already working on the next steps. This changes everything, Watson. Lord Kincaid must be stopped. We can no longer treat this as a matter of a lone madman and a misguided occultist. There is a larger conspiracy at play here, and it is one that threatens the very fabric of society. I swallowed hard, my mind reeling from the implications of what Holmes had just uncovered. Lord Kincaid, a man of immense power, connections, and influence, had been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, using the bishop as his unwitting accomplice. And now, with the ritual undone and the bishop's ambition shattered, Kincaid remained a threat far greater than anything we had yet faced. Holmes paused and turned back to me, his expression determined. We will find him, Watson. We will bring him to justice, no matter what it takes. I nodded grimly. But how, Holmes? Kincaid has already shown us how well he operates in the shadows. How do we expose him? Holmes's lips curled into a small but knowing smile. One step at a time, my dear Watson. First, we need to gather what little information we can from Blackwood, and then we shall track Kincaid's movements. I have no doubt that he is already preparing his next move. And so, As the weight of the case pressed down upon us, we began the final leg of our journey, a journey that would lead us to the heart of the conspiracy and into a confrontation with the man who had sought to control it all. Lord Sebastian Kincaid's days of manipulating the world from the shadows were numbered. Holmes and I would see to that, no matter the cost. Chapter 6: The Final Reckoning. The air was thick with anticipation, a weight so palpable it seemed to hang in the room like smoke. The journey that had begun with the murder of a printer's apprentice now came to this, an inevitable confrontation with the mastermind behind it all, the elusive Lord Sebastian Kincaid. The wheels of fate had spun their course, and we were about to reach the end of this dark and twisted tale. It had been nearly a week since the bishop's confession. Since then, Holmes and I had tirelessly gathered every scrap of information we could about Lord Kincaid. The papers we had discovered, the coded messages, the whispers from the underground, it all pointed to one location, a grand estate on the outskirts of London, known only to the highest circles of power. The estate, aptly named Ravenscroft, was a sprawling mansion hidden in the fog-drenched woods, far enough from the city to avoid prying eyes, but close enough to remain an ominous symbol of Kincaid's influence. Holmes stood at the window of our Baker Street flat, his ever-watchful gaze fixed on the darkening sky. The cold wind howled through the streets below, but Holmes remained unmoved, his mind focused on the task at hand. "Tonight, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tinged with finality, "we make our move." I had long since grown accustomed to his unflinching resolve, but there was something different in his tone this time. A quiet intensity that told me this final confrontation was not just about bringing justice to the world, but about something deeply personal. Holmes had never been one to shy away from danger, but I could sense a certain reckoning in his eyes. He was determined to see this case through to its conclusion, no matter the cost. "What's the plan, Holmes?" I asked, carefully observing his every move. Holmes turned to face me, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a sharp, unwavering focus. "We will confront Kincaid, but we do so carefully. I suspect that Ravenscroft is not just his home, Watson. It is his fortress. It will be heavily guarded, and he will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens his position." I nodded, understanding the gravity of our task. This would not be a typical investigation. We were no longer chasing a ghost or unraveling a simple murder mystery. We were about to take on a man with the power and resources to reshape the world according to his whims. Lord Sebastian Kincaid had to be stopped, but it would require every ounce of wit and strategy we had to bring him down. The journey to Ravenscroft was long, the carriage cutting through the night as the landscape blurred past us. The fog grew thicker as we drew nearer, and the mansion slowly emerged from the haze, a towering silhouette against the moonlit sky. The iron gates were ajar, and the path leading up to the estate was lined with twisted trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. A sense of unease settled over me as we approached the imposing structure. Holmes, ever the strategist, had devised a plan. We would enter the estate under the cover of darkness, posing as travelers seeking shelter from the storm. Holmes's quick thinking and mastery of disguise had given us the edge. We had already scouted the estate from a distance, noting the guards and the patrols. Holmes was certain we could slip past them unnoticed, but we would have to move quickly and decisively once inside. As we approached the front door, Holmes paused and looked at me, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Be ready, Watson. This will be our most dangerous move yet." I nodded. The weight of the moment pressed on me like a heavy cloak. I wasn't entirely sure what awaited us within Ravenscroft, but I knew one thing for certain. This was the final step in a journey that would end either in victory or in defeat. The door opened with a creak, revealing a dimly lit hallway adorned with portraits of long-dead ancestors. The grand staircase loomed before us, leading to the upper floors where Kincaid undoubtedly resided. We slipped inside, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that lined the floors. The air smelled faintly of wood and candle wax, a strangely serene atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the sinister purpose of our visit. We moved quickly but quietly, making our way through the halls toward the heart of the estate. The guards we had seen earlier were nowhere to be found, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the tranquility of the mansion. Holmes led the way, his mind constantly assessing the situation, taking in every detail with the precision of a machine. At last, we arrived at a set of double doors, grand and imposing, gilded with intricate patterns. Holmes hesitated for a moment, listening carefully. There was a faint sound coming from within, voices muffled but unmistakable. Kincaid was there, no doubt, preparing for something. Whatever it was, we had to stop him. Holmes pushed the doors open slowly, his movements fluid and calculated. Inside, the room was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. A large desk sat in the center, covered with maps, papers, and strange symbols. Lord Sebastian Kincaid stood by the window, his back to us, staring out into the night. His tall, imposing figure was framed by the darkness outside, and his expression was unreadable. "Kincaid!" Holmes's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Kincaid turned, his expression cool and collected, as if he had been expecting us all along. His eyes were dark pools of calculation, and a faint smile played at the corners of his lips. "Ah, Sherlock Holmes! I've been waiting for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. The calmness in Kincaid's voice was unnerving, but it was the certainty with which he spoke that made me uneasy. He had been expecting us, perhaps even planning for this moment. "You've come to stop me, I assume?" Kincaid continued, his gaze flickering between Holmes and me. "How quaint. But you are too late. The ritual has already begun." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What ritual, Kincaid? You know as well as I do that your plans are nothing but a facade. You've been using the bishop and the occult to further your own ambitions, but it ends tonight." Kincaid's smile widened, and he took a slow step toward us. "Do you truly think you can stop me? I have already outmaneuvered you, Holmes. You may have solved the puzzle, but you've underestimated my reach." Holmes took a step forward, his posture rigid with resolve. "The game is over, Kincaid. You can't hide behind your wealth, your influence, or your schemes. We have everything we need to bring you down." For a moment, there was only silence. And then Kincaid laughed, low and cold, like the sound of a serpent coiling in the dark. "Do you think it's that simple? I've been preparing for this moment for years, Holmes. I've anticipated every move you've made, every step you've taken. You are a mere piece in my grand design. And now, you will be the one to fall." Before we could react, Kincaid raised his hand, and the room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and strange symbols began to glow on the floor, illuminating the room in an eerie light. A sudden crash echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion. Guards, no doubt, rushing to the scene. But it was too late. Kincaid's final gambit had begun, but Holmes was already moving, his quick mind calculating every possibility. He sprang forward, grabbing a nearby candlestick and hurling it at the glowing symbols. There was a blinding flash of light, and the symbols flickered and died. Kincaid's face contorted in rage. "No! You!" Before he could finish, Holmes lunged, knocking Kincaid to the ground. The two struggled briefly, but in the end, it was Holmes who emerged victorious. Kincaid lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his once imposing figure now crumpled and defeated. "You lost, Kincaid," Holmes said, his voice steady. "Your game is over." The authorities arrived shortly thereafter, led by Lestrade and a contingent of constables. Kincaid was arrested, his plans finally undone. The ritual he had so carefully orchestrated was nothing more than a hollow fantasy, a means to control, to manipulate, to bend the world to his will. But in the end, it was his own hubris that brought him down. As we left Ravenscroft, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the fog-covered landscape. The mystery had been solved, the villain defeated, and justice had been served. But as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were always more puzzles to solve, more lurking in the corners of the world. For Holmes, the game was never truly over. Epilogue: The shadows fade. The days that followed the unraveling of Lord Sebastian Kincaid's twisted schemes were quiet, almost eerily so. The fog that had shrouded London for weeks seemed to lift, as if the city itself had exhaled a long-held breath. The press was abuzz with the arrest of Kincaid and the dismantling of the underground network of pamphleteers. The government made its statements, the courts prepared their case, and the people moved on, as they always did, forgetting quickly, swept along by the next scandal, the next headline. For Holmes and me, however, the world had not returned to normal. Though the case was closed, there remained an uneasy stillness, a sense that we had brushed against something darker, something more vast than we had initially realized. I, for one, found myself wondering how many more Kincaids were lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment. It was an overcast morning when I arrived at Baker Street, ready to spend another day in the company of my friend. I had grown accustomed to these quiet mornings, though they had become rarer in recent weeks. Holmes had not spoken much about the case since its resolution, his mind already moving toward new puzzles, new enigmas to unravel. As I entered the familiar flat, I found him seated by the window, his pipe in hand, his gaze fixed on the bustling streets below. The room was still and dark, the fire long since burned out, leaving only the faint smell of smoke in the air. "Holmes," I said, approaching him, "it's a quiet morning, isn't it?" He turned his head slowly, his sharp eyes scanning me with the usual intensity. "Indeed, Watson, but I suspect this quiet will not last long." I sat across from him, unable to contain the question that had been on my mind since our return. "Do you think it's truly over, Holmes? Kincaid's defeat, the disbanding of the network, it all seems so final." Holmes's expression softened slightly, though there was a trace of that distant, almost imperceptible sadness in his eyes that I had seen before in moments of reflection. "For most, yes. The world moves on, and people forget. But you and I know, Watson, that there are always more mysteries, more webs to untangle. Kincaid was merely a single thread." I nodded, understanding. "And what of the others? The pamphleteers, the ones who followed him?" "Many of them will scatter," Holmes said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "Some will go underground, others will be picked up by the authorities, and still more will disappear into the fog, as always happens with such movements. But the question remains, Watson, who will replace Kincaid, and what will become of the ideas he inspired?" I leaned back in my chair, contemplating his words. There was a grim truth to them, one I had known but had not fully accepted. In every era, there were those who sought to manipulate, to bend the will of others for their own purposes. And for every leader who fell, another would rise to take their place. Holmes seemed to sense my thoughts and spoke again, his voice softer this time. "The world will always be a stage for those who crave power. The game never truly ends. But it is the nature of the game, Watson, that keeps me in it. The search for truth, for justice, for answers. That is what drives me." I watched him in silence for a moment, marveling at the unwavering certainty that radiated from him. In some ways, he was a man at odds with the world, detached from its petty concerns. Yet in other ways, he was its greatest advocate, its savior, even. A man who, despite his many contradictions, always fought for what was right, no matter the cost. "I suppose that's what makes you so extraordinary, Holmes," I said finally, my voice tinged with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. "You never stop searching. Even when the world moves on, you're still looking, still seeking." Holmes smiled slightly, a rare, almost imperceptible smile that softened the edges of his normally stoic expression. "Perhaps, Watson, perhaps, but I have you to thank for keeping me grounded, for reminding me that the pursuit of truth is not a solitary journey." I sat in silence, reflecting on those words. In many ways, Holmes was a man apart, a solitary figure driven by an insatiable need to solve the mysteries of the world. But it was also true that without me by his side, without my own humble contributions, he would not have been the man he was. We were partners, and though our paths often diverged, they would always lead back to each other in the end. The weeks turned into months, and life in London returned to its usual rhythm. The cold winds of winter gave way to the first whispers of spring, and the city began to stir with renewed energy. But for Holmes and me, there would be no rest. The shadows of Fleet Street had not disappeared entirely, and as we both knew too well, there would always be another case, another mystery to solve, another villain to confront. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk writing in my journal, Holmes entered the room with his usual swift, purposeful stride. He was holding a letter, its seal already broken, the paper creased from being hastily unfolded. "Well, Watson," he said, his voice laced with that familiar spark of excitement, "it seems our services are once again required." I set down my pen and turned to face him. Another case? Holmes smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. Indeed. Another mystery. The game is afoot, my dear Watson. And with that, we turned toward the next adventure, leaving the shadows of Fleet Street behind us, but knowing all too well that the pursuit of truth would never truly end. The end. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.